He was never elected by anyone. Yet for a certain period, he was the most feared man in all of Argentina. Minister of Social Welfare, personal advisor to Isabelita Perón, alleged secret leader of the Argentine Anticommunist Alliance, a feared death squad, one of the darkest symbols of Argentine political violence. Telling his story even today means moving between news, historiography, traumatic memory, superstition, and fear. Because, well, few historical figures move along such a thin line between dark myth and historical analysis. So exactly, who is López Rega, our protagonist today? A man, a politician, an advisor, a sorcerer. Who was José López Rega really? It's not easy to navigate the twists and turns of history to understand who this very particular man was, this powerful man. And yet, sometimes he stayed in the background, underestimated. They used to say he was a truly incredible man, a man who therefore, for perhaps too long, was underestimated. In Buenos Aires, from 1973 to 1975, there was an unspoken uncertainty. What is López Rega? He was more influential than the ministers, more than the governors, sometimes even more than the president himself. Yet he almost never appeared in public. He spoke only just enough. He dressed with extreme sobriety. Yet his name alone was enough to inspire fear. Years later, a former union leader, in front of the commission investigating the dictatorship period, would say, "If López Rega had you in his sights, you were a dead man." Why? López Rega didn't have an electoral base. He didn't lead a party. He didn't even have a traditional political career. Yet, for many historians, he represented the focal point between political violence, the state, and reactionary ideology in pre-dictatorship Argentina. Born in 1916, the son of a relatively modest family, López Rega joined the Argentine Federal Police at a young age. Historical sources agree on one fact. Nothing in his first 40 years of life suggested the meteoric rise that would turn him into one of the most powerful men in the entire country. According to historian Felipe Pina, López Rega belongs to that category of mid-level officials who grew up in an environment of discipline, hierarchy, and personal loyalty. He is a sort of man mass-produced by the authoritarian state, writes Pina, but who only manages to emerge in exceptional circumstances. And these circumstances are the return from exile of Juan Domingo Perón and his wife, his second wife, Isabelita. Historiography agrees in recognizing that the encounter with Isabel Martínez de Perón changes everything. First a dancer and singer in nightclubs, then his personal secretary, and finally the companion and wife of the leader in exile. Isabel is described by many accounts as a fragile, insecure woman, politically inexperienced, very different from Evita, the president's previous wife. Maria Seohani, in her book El Brujo, The Sorcerer, dedicated specifically to López Rega, writes that López Rega understood before anyone else that the real channel to power was not Perón, but the woman who accompanied him. According to several accounts, López Rega presents himself as a protector, as a spiritual guide, as a trusted advisor. He never openly challenges Perón's authority, but he insinuates himself into the intimate space of power. He is a hidden advisor, and this is where his dark legend is born. In the 1970s, the independent Argentine press nicknamed him El Brujo, the sorcerer. Why? Because López Rega is interested in astrology, numerology, and esoteric rituals. He joins the Freemasons. His name even appears in the lists of Licio Gelli's P2. López Rega makes no secret of his interest in the occult. Some stories collected by journalist Horacio Verbisci talk about political decisions being postponed or brought forward based on the observation of the stars or on the use of amulets, talismans, or convinced that Argentina's destiny was being written in a sort of cosmic order. I don't know, maybe all this sounds pretty funny to you. But for years, these elements were dismissed as folklore or madness. But more recent historiography has offered a different interpretation. For example, the author Alejandro Cataruzza observes that esotericism was not an escape from reality. Instead, it was a language of power. It was used to create distance, awe, mystery, or in a single word. With the return of Perón to Argentina, as we saw last month, in 1973, López Rega made his definitive leap in quality. He becomes the head of a ministry, the Ministry of Social Welfare. A ministry that, on paper, should actually be dealing with social policies. According to later judicial investigations, the ministry becomes a parallel structure of power. A former employee of the ministry itself would testify years later and say that the funds were authorized without any control. No one dared to ask for explanations. Everyone knew that López Rega decided everything. His ministry was a political stronghold, a center for financing and recruitment. But for whom and whose? You can see him on June 20, 1973 at Ezeiza Airport. Juan Domingo Perón is returning from exile. He is destined to become the new president. What should have been a moment of celebration turns into a massacre. The Peronist right massacres the independents and radicals at the airport. The images of armed militants shooting into the crowd mark a turning point. Rodolfo Walsh will write that on that day, Peronism committed suicide by shooting itself. Several historians see in the Ezeiza episode the public birth of the regressive and repressive strategy that López Rega would help to systematize. Verbici also agrees. He says that Ezeiza was not an accident, as it was classified at the time, but a dress rehearsal for what would happen later, the death squads. It is in this context that an acronym emerges, destined to become ominously well known, that of the Argentine Anticommunist Alliance. The Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, according to the Nunca Más report. The Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance is responsible for hundreds of murders, kidnappings, and attacks between 1973 and 1976. For years, the dominant narrative identified López Rega as the absolute leader of the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance. Today, things are more complex. Carlos Osorio, by analyzing declassified documents, came to speak of a real network made up of the police, military sectors, Orthodox Peronist unionists, and even a compliant segment of the Argentine judiciary. Of this entire network, López Rega was the coordinator, the one who provided political and financial cover. A parallel structure which went on to wage an undeclared dirty war against a segment of the country. The testimonies collected by the investigative commissions are explicit. A former member of the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance recounted that within the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, it was known that they were essentially not part of the army, but they were still men of the state, even without uniforms, and López Rega was their leader. The fear was not so much of dying, but of being changed. No one defended the victims of the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance because no one wanted to go against López Rega. At this point, a question arises. Isabelita Perón, how much did she know? Did she know anything? And if she knew, why didn't she intervene? According to Maria Seohani, attributing everything that happened, all the murders, kidnappings, and attacks by the Autoridad to López Rega means absolving Isabelita and the entire Peronist apparatus. That wasn't the case. According to the analyses conducted between the two, between the widow Perón, the president, and López Rega, there was a power pact. The minister offered control and repression. Isabel, in return, guaranteed institutional legitimacy. But something is bound to change. The power of Isabelita Perón is not eternal. It is a power destined to crumble, and it begins to crumble starting at the end of 1975. The fall of Isabel Perón takes place in 76. But already when some cracks begin to appear in the power of the widow Perón, López Rega flees and becomes the ideal scapegoat. For example, the historian Claudia Hilb writes, personalizing evil allows political systems to absolve themselves. And in fact, the demonization of the Brujo López Rega has often worked as a mechanism of self-absolution for Peronism, and more generally, of all those political institutions that had tolerated or even supported and financed the violence. When the military overthrew Perón on March 24, 1976, López Rega was actually already far from Argentina. His escape is neither hasty nor chaotic. It's the sign of a man who foresaw in advance that the political cycle was over, but who already had secure channels abroad. López Rega, according to several accounts, leaves as early as July 75, officially as a plenipotentiary ambassador in Europe, without an assigned diplomatic post, but with the possibility to inspect all the embassies. In reality, it was a preventive exile, agreed upon and protected, a transfer with diplomatic cover. This would be revealed several years later by a former official of the Argentine Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The first stage of the exile seemed natural. It's Francoist Spain, where Juan Domingo Perón had already been. Franco is dying when Perón returns to Argentina. But Spain is the right place, and it's not a random choice. López Rega initially settles in Madrid with regular documents. He frequents circles linked to the Spanish far-right, international anti-communist networks. He takes advantage of his contacts mainly with sectors of neo-Francoism, with the military, and with the defectors from Ginter Press. Do you remember it? The Black Orchestra, the terror agency, the real specter. We talked about it in a video you can find on the channel. Former French organization Armée Secrète members who served the fallen regime, first under Salazar and then under Caetano in Portugal. López Rega doesn't live as a fugitive in Madrid. He lives as a protected man. He's a highly respected advisor. According to some accounts, although there is no definitive proof, he may have been directing things, or at least providing his advice. Behind the massacre on Calle de Atocha, the killing of lawyers connected to the union movement, who were gunned down by Francoist extremists, the death of Franco in 1975 and the beginning of Spain's democratic transition made López Rega's position more fragile, and that's exactly why. El Bruco started to travel. He first moved to Switzerland, then to other European countries, always keeping a low profile. In Switzerland, he used opaque financial networks and slush funds. They were probably embezzled during his time as a minister and exported without authorization from the Argentine state. On this subject, an Argentine magistrate involved in the investigation into the Ministry of Social Welfare would declare years later, "We followed the money trail, but every time it stopped at a European bank, and through letters rogatory, we really couldn't find the end of the flow." López Rega made one thing clear in all this. He wasn't just an ideological fanatic. He wasn't a man only tied to his passion for astrology, numerology, or esotericism. He was also a man involved in international financial circuits, able to guarantee him anonymity and continuous survival. According to some historical sources, during those years in Europe, López Rega became a progressively isolated man, almost paranoid, obsessed with the possibility of being betrayed. Others, however, emphasize that even while staying far from the spotlight, López Rega never stopped feeling like he was part of a sort of political mission. But here another question arises. Why was López Rega never prosecuted all these years? It takes quite a long time before an international arrest warrant is issued against him. But here too, we need to understand why it took so long and why the investigation started late. First of all, in the 1970s, there was no effective and coordinated international justice system. Then, from many sides, remember, we're still in the Cold War period, there was a certain political ambiguity toward the crimes committed before the military dictatorships, as if before the arrival of Videla and Galtieri in Argentina, no one had ever been killed. And then, within the climate of the Cold War, indirect protection for Peronist figures was always guaranteed. Carlos Osorio observed, López Rega benefited from the same logic that had protected the torturers and the coup plotters. The moral pass, the open sesame, is always and only anti-communism. In 1986, however, this protective shield collapses. López Rega is arrested in the United States where he had moved. This is a decisive turning point. For the first time, his name is formally included in an international judicial proceeding. At that time, López Rega was living under a false name and in different conditions than before. He was an old, sick man. He was portrayed as a fugitive. One of the FBI agents who arrested him told the newspapers, "He doesn't look like a monster. He just looks like someone defeated by history, a man who knows he is lost." Soon after, the extradition to Argentina arrives, marking the end of his exile and, symbolically, the end of the dark myth of López Rega, who returns home not as a powerful minister, but as a defendant in a trial. He refuses to speak, refuses to cooperate, to clarify things. He dies in the prison hospital in 1989 before a final verdict. Hugo Vazetti writes, López Rega's final silence is consistent with his entire career, exercising power without ever publicly taking responsibility for it. What is López Rega? He is remembered in Argentine memory, but not only there as a symbol of terror, but also as a sort of unresolved figure in South American school textbooks. His name and photograph often appear as a sort of absolute evil. Meanwhile, historical research tries to reconstruct his complexity without, however, lessening his guilt. Vazetti wrote that studying the figure of López Rega means facing the dark sides of Argentine democracy, to see what Argentina was like under Domingo, Perón, and Isabelita, what Operation Condor launched by the CIA was, what Argentina really was before the generals, but above all, to look not only at what happened. The massacres, the death squads, that untouchable ministry with virtually unlimited funds. Rather, one looks at what was made possible by a network of collusion, complicity, and proximity. All this made possible the rise of El Brujo, the sorcerer José López Rega, the most powerful man in Argentina, without ever having gone through an election. The man who could decide political destinies, but also the life or death of many citizens, simply based on his own preferences and relationships, on what he thought could be useful for his own image. That's why the figure of López Rega is so darkly fascinating today. It's the allure of evil, of someone who, wielding power, a strong, almost untouchable power, can allow himself almost anything, and almost until the very end. Mixing the military, police, judiciary, ministries, occultism, esotericism, the P2 economic funds, move to Europe, Franco, post-Francoism, Atlanticism, NATO, anti-communism, the organization Armée Secrète Ginter Press. There's a bit of everything. Put it all in a shaker, shake it up, and you'll get this very peculiar figure, a political sorcerer who knew how to dominate with his name and, above all, his reputation. A very specific period in our history, a period that is sometimes underestimated, and instead, especially today, seeing what's happening even in Argentina, it needs to be rediscovered, to be studied, explored in depth, so that the same mistakes from back then are not repeated.